I remember my grandmother, of blessed memory, telling me stories of her childhood which involved the Shabbos Goy. This is a non-Jewish person who was employed by the house to basically do work on Shabbat so that the Jewish people didn't have to. But they were never allowed to be asked to do work on Shabbat. They were simply informed of what might be needed. So, for example, the family might walk into a room and say, "Wow, it's really dark in here." And the Shabbos Goy would know to turn on the lights. If, however, that person turned around and said, "Would you like me to turn the lights on?" then the Jewish member of the family would have to turn around and say no, because they would be causing work to be done. So instead they would just go into a room and remark, "My, how dark it is in this room." And the Shabbos Goy would leap to attention and run in and turn the lights on for them, although it wasn't really for them. And this is a really interesting loophole. Many people will know stories of Shabbos Goys from years ago. It's not something that is done very often anymore, and I think that's probably a good thing. But all of this comes down to, particularly when it comes to the light switches, comes down to the question of whether or not we can actually use electricity on Shabbat. When electricity started becoming publicly available, the rabbis of the time had a really interesting discussion to hold. Is turning on the lights similar in any way to any of the 39 melachot, the 39 forms of forbidden work on Shabbat? And after much discussion, they ruled by a small, very small majority, they ruled that actually it is forbidden. And they said it's because it's akin to lighting a fire. Now, you may think, but turning on a light is nothing like lighting a fire. Well, it's very interesting. I do have some sympathy for those who believe it's similar. And even though the physical process is very different, lighting a fire involves combustion, whereas turning on the lights involves the passage of electrons from one place to another. Nonetheless, the process is similar, not just in the sense of fires create light, just as a light switch, turning on a light switch creates light. But more than that, when you turn on a light, turn on the electricity, the reason the light glows is because the filament inside has become essentially superheated, and so to the point that it glows and radiates light. And it's that heating which the rabbis of the time said was basically the same as lighting a fire. And since lighting a fire is one of the things that's forbidden on Shabbat, therefore they said that turning on electricity on Shabbat is forbidden. Interestingly, though, the Jewish custom has always been that if there were a fire going before Shabbat, you can keep it going during Shabbat. There were those in Jewish history who said, no, that should be forbidden too. And that's why some people, particularly in the Orthodox world, might turn lights on before Shabbat and leave them on, because that's not causing work to be done. They might also, interestingly, use timers. And so the timers turn the lights on at some point that they know they'll be needed. And they'll say that that's not causing work to be done on Shabbat. You actually cause it to be done beforehand. It just happens to turn on later on. And that's a really interesting halachic loophole, which is part of, for some people, how to enjoy Shabbat. And so, again, we come back to this question of whether or not electricity can be used on Shabbat. In fact, interestingly, I would say there's much more a case for using electricity than there might be for driving. Driving certainly is a combustion engine that is much more like fire. But in a world like ours, where people live many, many miles from services and from community, then the question becomes, if they want to see people on Shabbat, then because we don't live in the shtetl anymore, where we just walk a few houses to the place of prayer, instead they choose to drive. I remember many years ago when I was, good grief, a teenager, I guess, and my stepfather at the time didn't like to drive to shul, but needed to, but at least he would turn the radio off. and my mother would turn the radio on saying, "You're already driving, so it doesn't make a difference." And they would keep on Shabbat morning as we drove to services. They'd keep flicking the radio on and off. The marriage didn't last. But it was an interesting way of looking at what do we do on Shabbat? What choices do we make on Shabbat? How do we use gadgets, devices, electricity, electronics, and so on? And in the Reform movement, we leave it to our members to decide. The original idea of the 39 Melachot is that they change the state of something. So we don't change the state of something on Shabbat because we let the world rest. And so there are those who turn around and say, "I prefer not to drive on Shabbat." But if so, what do? How can they be in services? Well, thankfully, we have streaming. And in our community, we really encourage people who aren't able to come to services or who choose not to drive. We encourage you to turn on a device and to watch our services streamed. In fact, this week, I'm going to have to do that because I'm in COVID isolation. I have been for a while and I've got a few more days. And so I've had to be very much by myself, hoping that symptoms don't develop. And so because there are many people in our community who are vulnerable to such things, I can't be in contact with other people. So I'll be watching our services online. And tonight's service is a family service, and that's going to be led by Brian. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to lead Torah study from home. Normally, I come in and help set up the equipment, but instead, I'm going to be leading it from home because I do think it's appropriate for me to turn on an electronic device. I don't see it as changing state of anything. And there are very interesting discussions about computers and can one use a computer, particularly in the conservative movement. For example, there are those who say turning it on to view something such as a Shabbat service might be appropriate, but then using it to print something would be different because then you're changing the state of the paper. So I'll be leading Torah study from Zoom tomorrow morning, and Brian has thankfully stepped in for me in the morning service as well. In coming weeks, we're actually going to see a slight tweak to how we present services online. Because you may remember, for those who were part of our community during COVID, we had a really close Zoom community. And I really want to help bring that back. For a few years, we moved away from Zoom, and I really want to bring it back. And since we have this remarkable software, the OWL software, my hope is that during Shabbat morning services, not tomorrow, but hopefully next week, during Shabbat morning services, instead of the streaming camera, which is much further away, we'll have a much closer camera, and we'll be able to see all the people on Zoom. And that means you'll be able to share your thoughts. If you're remembering someone at this time, then you'll be able to share their name out loud. If you want to mention someone for the Mishaberach, you'll be able to share their name out loud, which you haven't been able to do for quite a long time. And so I'm very thankful that I am a Reformed Jew, that I do believe that it is appropriate to use electricity on Shabbat, particularly to help connect to prayer services. So even though I may not see you in our prayer service this evening at 5:30 for the family service or tomorrow morning, hopefully I'll be able to see you at Torah study tomorrow, where we'll be looking at Joseph and the concept of radical forgiveness. And is Joseph's understanding of forgiveness appropriate or not? I'll be out of COVID isolation in a couple of days, and I hope to see you then, and I wish you Shabbat Shalom.